Get started. First of all, welcome all of you. I appreciate everybody coming. So I'm Ron Feldman. I'm the bank's, it says here I'm the first vice president. That's a totally unintelligible kind of title. So I'm the chief operating officer of the bank. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about what it is we do here at the Fed. And let me give one step back. So we've had these conversations with the Fed for a while, and they've had different topics. Oftentimes they're focused on sort of a specific kind of, almost like an academic type of topic. And that's not what this is. This is going to be trying to introduce you to basically everything that's happening in the building. And the motivation for this comes a little bit from some interviews that we've been doing as we've been hiring people. And one of the most interesting things I've found is when we interview people in the Twin Cities for jobs, and I've been involved in some of these interviews, these are people who are on boards of nonprofits, of public companies, people who are very engaged in the community, and to a person they almost all say the same thing. I walk by this building, I see this building, I have no idea what happens here. I don't understand it, and it's all sort of a mystery to me. And so what I want to do and what I want you to leave here with is an understanding of what we're doing, but not at the sort of intellectual level. So a little more at the personal level, that we have almost 1,000 people that are working in this building, that these people are working for you. That's what we're doing. We're doing lots of different things, but they're all for the public. And that people care a lot about that mission and are doing the best they can to try to basically help everybody in this room in different ways. And if you only took away one thing, I hope at the end of the session, I've convinced you of that that's what we're trying to do, that's what we're about, and that you leave with that. And so a little bit of that is some context setting, because I think when the Fed is in the papers, it's typically about relatively obscure things that are like monetary policy, which isn't obscure, but the way it's described is often sort of technical. Or people talk about, the Fed, after the crisis, they're helping out big banks and all those things. And I think if you knew more people who worked here and had a better sense of what we're doing, I think you'd be able to put a lot of that in some context. So that's what I want to accomplish. I would encourage people, I've done a couple of these before. They work much better if people have questions. I don't mind if I don't get through all of my slides. It's not a big deal. I'll use them some other time, or I'll come home tonight, I'll show them to my family. I mean, don't worry, I'm not worried about getting through them. I don't get judged by that. So if you have questions, we'll do it as we go along. And if people need to leave because the questions are too long, that would be ideal in some sense. So before I get too far, let me give you a disclaimer. We have to give disclaimers at the Fed. So I'm speaking for myself here. I'm not trying to speak on behalf of anybody else. So I tried to make this more modern. So if I'm retweeting it, I'm not endorsing. So if I point to something else, these are going to be. I'll be clear what my views are. And if I reference somebody else, that's their views. So again, what are the bottom lines that I want to leave you with? So the first part is you should care what we're doing. Right? You have a right to care what we're doing. We want you to care what we're doing, right? So why do we want you to care? We work for you, and I'm going to explain that. I think the way in which we work for you is really obscure, and so I want to make that more real and have you understand that. Everybody here is working on something important. Hardly anybody here is working on monetary policy. Monetary policy is super important. That's what gets attention. That's really not what most people at the bank are doing. And that doesn't mean that monetary policy is less important or the things we're doing is less important. It just means you should have a flavor for all the things we're trying to do to help you out. And then finally, we're trying where are we going? What are we trying to do? We want to be what we're calling thought leaders, and I'm going to try to explain what that means. But basically, we're not just sort of sitting here and trying to do the same thing over and over again. We're trying to figure out how we can do things better and how we can take on the most important issues. Okay, so let me start with, I know a bunch of you took the tour, and the tour covers Fed 101. I'm going to do a little bit of Fed 101 too, I guess 101 period, but also. So I think it is important to put our bank in the context of the Federal Reserve System, because it's really an unusual system, and I know many people have heard this, but I think if you have a question about it, I'd like you to ask, because it's not a really standard kind of governmental entity. So when the Federal Reserve was created, there was a sort of bifurcated system. We have a board of governors in DC, and that's a governmental entity. Then we have reserve banks, 12 of them, as you can see the map. We're in the 9th district, which includes the states of Montana, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, the western portion of Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So that's our territory. And we are incorporated separate legal entities. We get oversight from the folks in DC, but we're separate. And the whole point is that we are not part of the government in one sense, in the sense of we're not a governmental entity. On the other hand, we are part of the government, as I'll sort of explain. We're here in Minneapolis. We're not in New York, we're not in other places, so we're representing what we're hearing here, but we're taking a national view. So the idea is to take the best of lots of different organizational structures in the country, public, private, and bring it together here. And maybe the last thing I'll say just about our structure is this isn't by accident. It wasn't that people didn't try to design it this way. They did. The idea was that we're not simply going to be moving according to the whims of what's happening with political leaders. We're not going to just be part of what's happening with the big money center banks, the big banks, financial activity in New York, but instead we're going to be part of the country, but engaged with those other parts. So maybe just bring it a little close up. So we have an office here in Minneapolis, and then we have an office in Helena, Montana. How many people have been to Helena? That's a lot. That was like a fifth of the crowd. Normally, there's not that many people who've been to Helena. Helena's a small place. So Helena is, as far, people, this is an amazing statistic. I go check it every time to make sure it's true, and it really is true. It's as far from here to Helena as it is from here to Washington, D.C. So that gives you a sense of how broad our district is. Why are we in Minneapolis and in Helena? That was part of the design that was set up where they had to pick some cities to be places where the reserve banks would be located. There's a lot of political sort of dealing about, if you have it here, we can have it some other place. Is this optimal in some sense? If you went back and divided the country up by population, would you stick something in Minneapolis and Helena? I don't know, probably not. I don't think that's exactly how it would end up. Is it working the way it is? I mean, mostly. So it seems like this is sort of a strange sort of setup in terms of the geography, but it seems like it's largely working. And it gives us, at least my view of it, is that we're almost, sort of spanning the whole district. So, but just looking at these maps, it sort of reminded me this is a really antiseptic way to look at the district. How many people have seen this art in our lobby? I think almost everyone has seen it. You had to see it going in. It's kind of amazing, right? It has all these details about what's happening in the district right now. Some of it historically, there's Lewis and Clark, there's other things that get pointed out. And I'm showing it because it gives you a sense of how complicated things are, how much is really going on, and we're trying to represent all of that, not just some sort of flat map that looks like there's nothing happening. There's tons of things happening in this district. So why should you care? Why should you care? I'm motivating that. Again, I'll just repeat because you can't repeat these things enough. What do I want to leave? What do I want you to leave here? I want you to leave understanding that you have a right and an obligation to know what we're doing, and that we're trying to make good on that and trying to work for you. So why should you care? So this is probably the least interesting thing I could put up, but I think it gets to the heart of it, right? So what you're looking at here is last year's income statement for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So that's basically what money did we have come in, and what money did we have coming out. And I hope, you probably can't see it necessarily, but so 777, that's the amount of our interest income. So it's almost, it's in millions, right? So it's almost $1 trillion of income, right? So where are we getting that money from? So somebody said, we're all the bonds we have, right? Okay, so I knew someone was going to say that. These are people in New York who buy and sell the bonds that we have. This is an actual picture of people who sit at the trading desk at the New York Fed, and they buy and sell bonds that we own. And I'm just going to say right now, just to keep this mildly interesting, that we do that as part of setting monetary policy. And I'm happy to take questions on that later. But let's just suspend disbelief about that. But just understand, you have to set monetary policy. The way we do it is we buy and sell securities, right? We own a lot of securities, so we have a balance sheet that's worth $4.5 trillion. We get the income from that, and that's how we're funded. So usually people stop there, and they just say, that's how the Federal Reserve is funded, they own these bonds, and they get the income from it. But I think that sort of misses the point, right? Because how did we get the bonds? Right? I mean, where did we get the money to buy the bonds? I think that's a reasonable question. So how did we do it? So I was trying to think of a way what's the succinct way of saying that? So there's actually something on PBS. Does the Fed create money out of thin air? Where did we get the money of? Did we just create the money? Yes. That is how we got the money. So we created the money. So let me take a step back here. And again, I'll stop after to see if people have questions, because I think it's important because it does get to the fact that our funding is from taxpayers. So if you're in a country and you're going to have a system of money like ours, right, which is just paper bills and they're not backed by anything else. There's a fancy word for that, fiat money, right? You can imagine that there's a money where if you give the money, someone has to give you gold, or they have to give you corn, or they have to give you a big stone or something like that. We don't have that system. We have a system where we just give money. And in the US, who produces the legal money? It's the Fed. The Fed produces that money. And you can have other systems. We've had other systems historically where banks used to create money. That's not the system we have now. And the right to produce money is really valuable. The right to produce money is really valuable, and we've been given that right. And if you think about it, why is that valuable? Because if we want to buy a security, we go and let's say this person here, Amy, who I work with, and I say, Amy, I want to buy a security from you. I don't go and tax you for money and give it to Amy. I produce money and I put it in Amy's bank account. And then she gives me a security. At some point, I can sell that security. But people have to give me real money when I sell it. So I'm going to repeat that. We just take money, we create money by putting electronic money into Amy's account. We get something worth something. And then at some point, we sell it over time, and we get real money from that. Plus, we get the interest income. That's where we got the money to have the bonds. That's where we get money. And we get the money because we've been given the right to produce money. Now, it ends up, people really like money. People like having an economy with money. Why? Because it gives you something that you can go and you can say, here's $1, and someone gives you something worth something, right? So it's worth something to you. So it's not, we weren't given that right just because, hey, it's fun to do. It's something that people in society really want. But nonetheless, it's a right that we have. It could have been given to someone else. And we use that right to basically fund ourselves. I'm going to stop there and just see if anyone has questions about that. Because that's fundamentally, now, you could make this more complicated, and there's lots of ways of thinking about this, but I think at a general level, that's the right way to think about it. Yeah?
What limits the Fed's ability to make money?
Right. So, yes, I don't need to repeat it. I could repeat it if I'm trying to stall. I'll just drink instead. So what limits our ability? So that's interesting. So we have two mandates that we've been given. I said I wasn't going to, most of the people in the bank are not working on monetary policy, but I'm going to do a little monetary policy real quick. So we have two things we're supposed to be doing. We're trying to make sure that inflation doesn't get too high in some sense, and we want to make sure as many people are as working as possible. If you keep putting money, and not taking any out, or not sort of compensating for that, then you're going to get inflation, and we wouldn't be doing our job on the inflation front. So that's the constraint. There's no legal constraint that stops us. And if you go look at other countries who are in the middle of certain problems, Venezuela, for example, I mean, every year, thank God, there's at least one country that's having terrible inflation, so you can always point to them. And it's terrible. I'm just saying that there are countries where there are always an example every year. What they're doing is they're printing tons and tons of money. They're literally printing money constantly. So that's what constrains us. But the bottom line is, it's from that legal right that we fund ourselves. That's how we get the bonds. And the bonds are just sort of like, I don't want to say the symptom of the disease, but the bonds are sort of what happens after the fact. It's the ability to create money that's funding us. And we get that from Congress, and Congress is obviously a creature of the people. And that's why you have an obligation to understand what we're doing with the money. Any other questions about that? It's different, right? It's not how the Department of Interior is funded. That's much more straightforward. People write taxes, people pay taxes, taxes go into a fund, some of that goes to the Department of Interior. That's not how the Fed operates. But effectively, we've been given a right that generates money, which is like a tax. Okay, so I'm going to cover now what we're doing in this building. I feel like I've explained why we work for you and why people here understand that. So let me talk a little bit about what we're actually doing here. So what are the things that we do? So I'm going to try to do this a little differently than I've done before. And again, ask questions as we go. I'm not going to try to cover every single thing that someone is doing here. We've got little sort of one-off groups of folks. But I do want to cover the major sort of populations of the group. And I'm going to do it by introducing you to specific people who work here. So this is Connie Tran. Connie works in our banking supervision group. She's a manager over a group of bank examiners. Connie has an amazing story. If you ever want to Google Connie Tran, T-R-A-N, you'll see there's a great story that Minnesota Public Radio had about her connection to Walter Mondale and sort of some of the work that he had done in bringing people over from refugees from Vietnam. So it's amazing, and I would encourage you to look it up. And that's why I picked Connie, was because she was okay with having her picture in front of a group of strangers, because it's happened before. So what do we do when we examine banks? So we check to make sure banks are operating safely so they don't fail, that they're not taking on too much risk. We are making sure that they're following the consumer rules that they're supposed to be following. So there's a bunch of rules that Congress has passed that try to make sure people don't get ripped off fundamentally, and we try to make sure that banks are complying with those rules. And then finally, in the big scheme of things, we want to avoid another financial crisis like we had. And I think people think that one reason we had a financial crisis is what the Fed and the Treasury Department and the other folks who had that responsibility didn't do a good job in making sure that banks weren't taking on too much risk and weren't ripping people off. So I ran that department here at the bank before I had this job. We didn't do as good a job as we should have. There's no denying that. We're trying to do a better job. And I think the consequences of us not doing a good job are really apparent. So we're learning and trying to do a better job. And part of the people that are doing that are people like Connie, who oversee examiners that are doing these exact sort of things. Yeah?
You say you didn't do a good job, but couldn't you realistically say that is a fault of the change in legislation that loosened regulation so that you didn't really have a right to do more than, say, you did decades ago as far as regulating the banks?
Yeah, I'd love to say that, but I don't think that's what happened. I mean, I do. So some of that happened. I mean, there were things that were changed over time, but I think fundamentally, having been there, I think we did not take actions when we knew that banks were engaged in behaviors that were really high risk, and we weren't aggressive enough in trying to stop them. Now, I think it's a fair point that if we had tried to do that, would have been the reaction, and we would have been allowed to do it. But I think, unfortunately, we really didn't test that limit. So, it would have been much better historically if we had gone to banks, for example, that were making lots and lots of loans for commercial real estate. And at the time, remember that commercial real estate also included, if you went to a suburb and you were going to do a housing development, and you were the 17th developer that was going to do that, and you all had the same story, which was, hey, everybody's going to buy these houses because housing prices are going to go up and they never fall. And we probably should have been more stringent in looking at how banks were doing that. So, yeah, I wish it was somebody else. That'd be more convenient for sure, but I don't think that captures our culpability there.
Does the Minneapolis Fed have any involvement with the customer issues with Wells Fargo?
So we don't. So it's interesting how who does what in the bank regulatory system is as complicated as anything else I've ever been involved with. I don't even mean like doing the job. I just mean explaining to people how we've divided up who does the job. So it ends up that if you look at Wells Fargo, there's lots of different corporate entities, but there are two that are really important. So one is the bank, and then one is the company that owns the bank, which surprisingly is called a bank holding company because it holds an asset, which is primarily the bank. There's lots and lots of Wells Fargo activity in this area, but it's all based in San Francisco. And so the bank itself is supervised by the Treasury Department. The holding company is supervised by the Federal Reserve, but out of San Francisco. So despite the fact that they're so prevalent here, we don't really have any role in their supervision. In retrospect, that was probably good for us, given I already said that one thing we didn't do well was effectively carrying out our duties. Yeah.
I was just curious, how much say does the Fed have when Congress decides to regulate banks?
Go ahead.
How much say does the Fed have when Congress decides to regulate banks? So like in context of the Dodd-Frank Act, I was just curious, how much say did the Fed have with that?
Yeah, so I mean, anything that Congress does, ultimately Congress is the one who's making those decisions. I think on different pieces of legislation, different folks who are moving that along in Congress might consult with people who they view have expertise, but fundamentally that's their decision, and they don't ever I'm not ever aware where they would sort of, on something like Dodd-Frank, say, here, Fed, you sort of figure that out for us and we'll just pass it. I mean, that's not how it works. Any other questions about the supervision part of it? So we've got about 175 folks who are working in this area. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, how much control do you have on underwriting standards? Going back to your comment, kind of not taking blame for some of the problems almost 10 years ago now. The Fed, as I understand it, would have had to recognize the change in underwriting standards in a whole range of things, not just commercial, but individual as well. And would you really have been able to change that from the Federal Reserve?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I say we take responsibility, so, there's actually a relatively small number of banks that we directly are supervising. So I'm speaking on behalf of all my regulatory brethren who are not here, who I just said I wasn't speaking on their behalf. I'm just speaking for myself. But I would hope that they would take a little responsibility as well. So let me just define what the question is a little bit, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So underwriting standards are, you have to make a decision who's going to get a loan. And you're going to base that on, for example, what kind of collateral do they have. So if you're going to lend them $100, you might want to make sure that they give you something worth $85 so that if they don't pay you back, you can at least sell that for $85. Or you might want to say, well, how much income does this person have? Let's say they're making $100 a week. Well, I'm not going to lend them more than $25 because I know they're getting $100. I want to make sure they have enough income to pay me back. So that's what underwriting standards are, how you're going to decide to do that. And the question was, well, as a bank regulator, do you actually go in there and look at their standards and say, hey, those standards aren't good and aren't bad? Yes, we totally do that. That's the core of what we're doing. And in fact, we can go in, and we're supposed to go in, and we look at the loans that they've made. And let's say they want to say, well, this loan is worth $75 on our books. We can look at that loan and say, you know something, we think that's only worth $50. And you have to, quote unquote, write that off. So you take something that's worth $75, you tell them, no, it's really only worth $50. That $25 of loss that they then have to take, and they have to, if they have enough of that, then that's going to erode all of the sort of equity they have. Sorry, I'm being attacked here by a fly. I mean, I'm not casting spells at you in a very Harry Potter kind of way. So yes, that's exactly what our job is. Now, I mean, so I think, but maybe rephrase your question. Hey, that's your job. How hard is it to actually do that? Well, it's really hard because usually there's not agreement. Usually the bank will say, hey, we're doing a really good job. Here's our track record. And we would say, well, I'm not sure that that's so good. And I think that's what we found during the financial crisis was, we were slow to really sort of aggressively say, hey, fundamentally, this is not a safe practice and you have to stop doing it. And we have got a lot of legal authorities to force people to stop doing things if we want to. But we have to exercise that power. Okay. So that was Connie. This is a broader group of people. I'm not going to introduce you to all of them. But these are folks in our bank here who effectively work for the Treasury Department. Now, they work for us, but the Federal Reserve carries out a lot of the responsibilities that the Treasury Department has. So what do I mean by that? So the Treasury Department sells debt, for example. Well, the Federal Reserve is sort of the group that actually helps do the back end of that. The Treasury Department for the U.S. government provides business cards, right? I mean, not business cards, but credit cards. We help process those payments. So a lot of the stuff that you wouldn't see that the Treasury Department does for the government, we actually do as the Federal Reserve. So the technical term is we're the fiscal agent of the Treasury. So we're actually doing a lot of things on behalf of the Treasury that are sort of nuts and bolts activities for them. So what are we doing at this bank? So let me see. How many people know what this is?
It's a savings bond.
It's a savings bond. Well, you didn't really give anyone else a chance. You knew that right away. Hardly anyone knows that. How many other people know what a savings bond is? Okay, well, a lot of people. I take it back. Savings bond. If you have anything associated with a savings bond in the country, there are two places in the United States that sort of work with this. There's a group of people in West Virginia who work for the Treasury Department, and then there's those people, let's see, can I go backwards? Yeah, these people. If you have a question about a savings bond, like, I'm not sure where I need to redeem this, or this is kind of complicated, I got the savings bond in an estate, or any question about a savings bond, that call is probably coming to someone who works here. And if you have called, they're very polite. They'll answer your call within 90 seconds. It's a really good call center. Part of my new job is I got to sit in and listen to them take calls, and they do a fabulous job. And sometimes I compare it to some of the service I get from unnamed private sector entities, and I'm just like, wow, I wish it was as good as the service the Fed offers people who've got questions on savings bonds. And some of the questions are super, super complicated. You can imagine, particularly things around inheritances and trusts, and can I redeem this? And this thing's super old. I just found this thing in my attic. Is it really worth something? And we've got people who go and they examine and they tell the Treasury, yes, you can pay this, or no, you can't. Well, we've got a big group of people who do that here on behalf of all of you. And if you have a question about a savings bond or anything related to savings bonds, it's happening probably here or it's happening in West Virginia. So that's one thing we do. So we supervise banks. We work on behalf of the Treasury and really work on behalf of you. And then we also provide payments. And payments come in lots and lots of forms. So I want to introduce you. This is Joyce Day. So Joyce works in Helena. So I said we have this Helena office, and I want to make sure there's some sense of what does that mean. And the same thing, if you go to Helena, so I was in Helena a couple weeks ago, and Dorothy Bridges here, she oversees the Helena group. Dorothy, you want to wave? So I went to an event called Hometown Helena in Helena, so they have it once a week where folks in Helena get together. And I was sitting with some folks and I was doing a talk sort of like this, and at our table, and someone said, oh yeah, and Helena's, like we already talked, it's a small place, right? So someone said, God, it's really a mystery what you guys are doing in that building. It's like, I can't escape this. I get it in Minneapolis because it's kind of a big building, it's a big city, we're all sort of anonymous. Helena's not a very big place. Everybody knew everyone else in this room, but they were like, the Fed, yeah, we know people there, but what are you guys doing in there again? Okay, so what is Joyce doing there? So Joyce and a group of people there and a group of people there here work with cash, right? We have a group of people in the cash department, which sounds really awesome that you work in the cash department. So what do you do if you work in the cash department? Okay, well, let's say you're a bank and you want cash. So I'm not using cash like figuratively or allegorically. I mean like dollar bills, in your wallet or whatever you're carrying it in. And the bank wants some, they come here and we give them that cash. So we don't print it. That's a question that comes up. Do we print the cash? No. We're distributing it and then we're receiving it. So why would we receive it? Well, a bank doesn't necessarily want to have a lot of cash lying around, so they'll bring it to us. And then we process it. So we've got machines, they count the cash, they destroy counterfeit bills, and it ends up, and this is probably, if you're on the tour, this is like a highlight of the tour, right? Cash is really can get kind of disgusting. I know, did they talk about that on the tour? No, they didn't bring it up? Yeah, let me just say, everyone in the cash department is wearing gloves, and that's not by accident. Counterfeit's pretty straightforward. The machines can tell when it's counterfeit, and they'll just destroy it. But sometimes, it's the cash comes in, and maybe it has drugs on it, or maybe it has other things that you don't want to have. And so we also process and destroy all of that. So that's what they do.
Ron?
Yes?
Could I just clarify one point?
Yes.
About counterfeits.
Yes.
Counterfeits we don't destroy. Counterfeits we send to the Secret Service for investigation.
That's good to know. I messed that up. We don't destroy it. We take it out of circulation. That's what I meant to say. Thank you. Yes?
Who takes the loss for the counterfeit bills?
The bank does. Not us. The person who provided it to us. So when they send us a bundle of, I think it's literally called a bundle, right? So the cash will be there, and we're gonna get it, we're gonna process it, and then they have an account with us, and we're gonna literally make a deposit for them. So let's say they thought they gave us $100. Let's say it was $250s. One was counterfeit and wasn't. They only get deposited $50. Yeah, it's on them because they have the capability of determining what's counterfeit as well. We've got really good machines that do that, but that's within reason that they could be doing that as well. Also, it gives them banks the incentive to try to get it out of the system. So it's not just falling to us if we had to take the hit. So I always thought it would be fun. But, do they do that? Do they just roll around in the money? I always wondered that. But no, they don't. They don't do that. So I'm going to take that off real quick because I don't want to leave you to believe that. Okay, so we've got people who are doing payments, cash. That's an example of payment. We have the stuff we're doing on behalf of the Treasury. We're supervising banks. And then we have a group of economists. I said this wasn't about monetary policy. A lot of the economists are working on monetary policy, but usually that's not their full-time job. What are they doing? They're doing economic research. This is one of them. This is Jonathan Heathcote. I didn't ask him because his picture was on the website anyway. So I was like, Jonathan, You've given up your right to privacy. So what are people like Jonathan working on? So again, I mean, they're doing some help on monetary policy, but they're doing their own research. And the idea is if we're responsible for things going on in the economy, which people ultimately hold us responsible for, we need people who are thinking deeply about how the economy works. So what does that look like? So it looks like that. Who knows? It's really hard to tell what they're doing, but that's what they're producing. And I'll just leave it at that. If you want to find out more about that, I would recommend going on the website and looking at Jonathan's papers, and you figure out if you can make heads or tails of that. No, but on a more serious note, I mean, most of the work that folks here are doing is the nuts and bolts of it is complicated, but the gist of what they're working on is actually super interesting and informs what we're doing. So, for example, Jonathan has worked on the distribution of income. He's worked on what's happening with land values. So a lot of things that I think are relatively accessible until you get past the first page. So that gives you a flavor of some of the things going on there. But obviously we have people at the bank that are also doing things that make the rest of the bank function, right? So we've got people who are supporting us. So this is Kenny Brewster. He's a part of the bank that actually works on behalf of the whole Federal Reserve System. So when you come into the bank and your computer's not working, we've got a group of people who answer calls for the whole Federal Reserve System. They work here, some of them work for Kenny, and they answer our questions about why our computer is not working, which they do a really nice job of. So we've got people here that are doing that. So I'm going to stop and see if anyone's got any questions about anything that I covered, but just also sort of anything else you wondered about what is happening here. So again, we've got roughly 1,000 people. Let's say 180, 190 are working in supervision, 175 are working for the Treasury, a bunch of them are working in IT, 35 are working in cash. So you add it all up, that's what people here do. They work on behalf of all of you doing these various services to make sure that their given responsibilities are working well. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Does your IT deal with cybersecurity as well?
Yes, that is a great question. So we have an information security group, and they're working on, so the Fed, as I sort of, remember that very first big picture. So there's 12 independent banks. I'm going to answer your question, but let me just use it to launch off into something that I think sort of explains what we're doing at this bank. So we've got 12 independent groups, and we've got the Board of Governors. So if all of us had our own information services group, and if all of us, had our own servers, and if we all were sort of replicating what we were doing, it'd be super inefficient, right? Because we would just have 12 little versions of ourselves. So what we've done is we've basically consolidated different parts, and I'll talk about this. We've consolidated different things in a given reserve bank that helps the whole Federal Reserve System. So we have a central group that's really working all the time to try to defend ourselves against cyber attacks, of which we're a really prime target for two reasons. So both the publicity that would get, but fundamentally, I said one of the things we do is we do payments. And banks, we are the primary means by which banks send money to each other. And you can imagine that that would be a great way if you were somehow able to get into the Federal Reserve System to get money out of the Federal Reserve System to someplace else. And so we spend a lot of time and money trying to be as effective as we can in preventing all of that. We're constantly getting barraged by folks who are trying to figure out a way to get in. And I'd say to date we've been very successful in mitigating all of that. Any other questions? Okay. Carmi, anything else you want to correct me on? Okay, all right. That's pretty good. Oh, okay, yeah. Wait, do you want to correct me on something now too?
No, Ron. I have a question about cybersecurity.
Sure.
There was a major Equifax breach that affected 140-some million people.
Yes.
Are you involved? Is the Fed involved at all in regulating or monitoring those agencies?
Yeah.
Not the individuals. That's not your role.
Sure. So the legal authority around things like credit bureaus are the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So they were given authority under Dodd-Frank for some aspects of what credit bureaus are doing. We don't have direct authority there. But getting back to the supervision angle, trying to think of the best way to say this in a straightforward way. So lots of banks outsource their own services that they have. Particularly if you're a smaller bank, it wouldn't make sense for every single bank to have its own sort of complicated accounting system and to have, particularly around IT. So there's a relatively small number of really big IT vendors to banks. Okay, so that's just sort of the background. So that makes sense, right? So banks basically outsource it to, and some of these, Federated, they're sort of very large firms that provide lots of services. Fiserv is another big one. So it wouldn't really make sense when we go look at every individual bank to figure out, oh, is Fiserv doing an effective job providing services? Because you could see how inefficient that would be. So we would go to this bank and we would say, is Fiserv doing a good job? Well, let's look at Fiserv here. Then we go to the next bank that's a customer of Fiserv, and we would look at the same thing, et cetera, et cetera. So instead, one thing we try to do is actually go to Fiserv and say, hey, what are you doing? How are you? How is that working? Are you, for example, when you get banks' data, how do you protect that from a cyber attack? So in that sense, all of the banking supervisors get together to try to look at these entities that we don't really have direct, we've got sort of an authority to do it, but we try to do it in a consolidated and efficient way. Equifax, Experian, the other credit bureaus aren't part of that program. So that's what we do look at, and that's the credit bureaus are sort of outside of that. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions on digital currencies. Does the Federal Reserve get involved with or monitor digital currencies? And second of all, does the Federal Reserve have an opinion on the usefulness of digital currencies?
Yeah, so I mean, we're certainly monitoring it in the sense of wanting to understand. So there's like at least two different ways you'd want to do that, because, and let me just start by saying I'm not an expert on either this blockchain technology, which is underlying these digital currencies, and already I've probably gotten myself on the edge of my knowledge by using those terms. But I think at a minimum we want to understand how it's working, whether it has implications for any of the other authorities we're supposed to be exercising, right? And in terms of our own view of it, so there's a governor. So at the Board of Governors, which was that entity in DC, there are people who are called governors. So here we have President Neil Kashkari. He runs the organization. At the Board of Governors, there's Chair Yellen, and then there are people that are governors. And there's a governor named Lael Brainerd, and she's taken the lead for the Federal Reserve, trying to think about those digital currencies, as well as what's called fintech, which are these new ways that people are using innovative technology to provide services that have maybe heretofore been provided by banks and asset managers and people like that. And I think that'd be the closest to have we expressed an opinion on it. I mean, she's given a variety of speeches which have basically said, here's our understanding of how it's working, here how it's implicating us. I don't think we've come out with a view like, these are bad, these are good. I mean, that's not something that I'm aware of that we've ever said. So the Bank of International, so I'm trying to avoid using a lot of jargon here, but there are international groups that work with central banks, and they have come out recently with some reports talking about, would it ever be prudent for a central bank to issue something like a digital currency? And, what would that look like and how would that work? But I think it's fair to describe that as sort of trying to think about things before they happen, as opposed to expressing a view and, thinking that this is something that's right on the horizon. Thanks. All right, so I thought I would conclude by talking a little bit. So I've talked about sort of what our core operations are, what we're doing here. I hope that's helpful. I mean, I don't know how many of you already knew that that's the kind of things that we're doing here, but that is what we're doing. And I hope that sort of reinforces the idea when you hear a lot about the Fed and I don't trust the Fed or I do trust the Fed. I think it's worth remembering that the Fed is actually a bunch of people who are processing your savings bonds, making sure that your cash isn't counterfeit, making sure that banks are operating safely, providing IT services. I mean, that's what it is, and it's those people that you saw. So we want to be thought leaders. That's a picture of the bank. I don't know if you noticed that, but that's where you're sitting. Well, actually, so where are we? I've got a laser pointer. We're not there. I think we are here? Are we there? There we are. Who knew? Apparently all of you did. So we're here. Okay, so what is being a thought leader? That sounds like kind of big talk. I mean, what does that mean in practice? So it means a couple of things. So one is, I said the Federal Reserve, and again, why am I telling you some stuff that might seem a little bit like inside baseball? It's because I think you have a right to know, and you should know what we're doing here. So we're trying to be leaders within the Federal Reserve. I kind of pointed out that not every Federal Reserve bank does the same thing. So I'll talk about some of the special things we do here on behalf of the whole Federal Reserve. We're always trying to make sure that the core things we're doing a better job at, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the thing that gets the most attention are the things where we go out to the public and we say, hey, this is a super important issue, and we're going to take a leadership role in making sure we understand how that works. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those efforts. And I know we said we were going to talk about this Institute for Inclusive Growth, so I'll talk about that in that context. So what else are some of the folks here doing? So it was hard to figure out exactly what to talk about because we've got different responsibilities. Some of them are harder or easier to understand. I think this is a little bit on the harder side, but I think it's kind of cool, so I want to talk to you about it. So how many people have heard of the stress test? That's the thing that we do. Oh, this is like the most informed group ever. So you knew where we were when I showed you the picture of the bank. I mean, it's sort of, you got everything under control. So just for a reminder for those that don't, so we do an exercise. The Federal Reserve does an exercise every year, and we do the following thought experiment. What if we had another crash in the economy? What would happen to the biggest banks? Would they fail or would they not fail? All right, so that's describing it at the highest level. So to do that, we have a bunch of computer models that we've created, and we sort of try to simulate what would happen to banks looking at their financial data. Now, what's pretty typical when you do an exercise like that is you have people who develop these models and they think these models are fabulous. What you want to do is you have someone else come in and they look at the model and they say, well, is that a really good model or not? So you've got like a little bit of challenge to make sure that you're doing it right. So the group that looks at those models on behalf of you to make sure those models are good are located here. Okay, so this is Lindsay Dietz. So she's one of the people that does that. Lindsay is a PhD in statistics from the U. Who's got a lot of experience looking at these computer models. So this is the kind of job you ought to have a lot of mathematical background in because these models are all mathematical. And we talk about this when we release the results. I just would read one line here. So it says, as in prior years, all models used for this year's supervisory stress tests were reviewed by an independent model validation team with a focus on design, estimation, and implementation of the models. Right. So when you read those words, next time you read those words, which I'm sure you're going to look at the stress test results, you should know that those people are here. And you should also know that Lindsay has an amazing jump shot. So Lindsay was an All-American basketball player at UMD who just was inducted into the UMD Sports Hall of Fame. So that's a big accomplishment. She said it was like her and 6 hockey players. She didn't say that. She was much more excited about it. So why am I showing you a picture of Lindsay, who's got a PhD in statistics in her basketball uniform? It's because, again, I want you to think a little bit about, and I want everyone, if anyone watches this in recording, to know that when you think about what the Fed is, these are the people that are actually working here. These are the kinds of people we're attracting. These are the kind of people who are excited to be here and to do this work, thinking that it's part of our public mission and that we've got really good jump shots. So another thing that we do here at the bank is, as I said, we sell these services to banks that let them make payments to each other. So how do we make sure that a bank that is sending a payment, a bank that says, hey, I'm the community bank of Richfield, I'm going to send a payment to the community bank of Chanhassen. How do we make sure that those are really who they say they are? Well, one thing we do is we are the people that give these little tokens out to banks that they put in their computers that verify, yes, I am the person who you think I am. And that's kind of a way that we make sure that, for example, somebody who just enters the system, sort of illegally can't do that because you need to have, this is like your ATM card, right? You need to have an ATM card and you need to have a passcode. Same thing. We require people to have something like a chip, and we require them to have a passcode and a bunch of other things. This is the place where banks get these chips. There's people here who take calls from them, who deliver these things and make sure that it happens. So we're doing those things, again, on behalf. And the fact that you don't normally hear a bank say, gee, someone sent out $100 million and they really shouldn't have, it's because of things like this. I want to talk a little bit about how we're improving operations. This is probably the most direct kind of thing that we're doing. It's sort of day to day, but I thought I would try to pick something that is a little bit relatable. So how many people have seen the protection folks we have here? They're always walking around. So this was a protest video that someone took of them. So this is a couple of the people that work in law enforcement. So one question you have, particularly when you become chief operating officer of a bank like this, is, well, how do we make sure that we're spending our money efficiently? If it's public money, we want to make sure we're not wasting it. We want to make sure that we are not spending more than we need. Loved our protection staff, but it costs money to have protection staff, right? So one thing we've tried to do is figure out, for a building that needs to be open 24 hours a day, for a building where we've got a lot of screening of anybody that comes in and out of here. I don't know how much screening we do for people in big crowds, but everyone gets screened, so you can see it's kind of an intensive process. So one thing we do, which I won't get into because I can't tell you, but if you use some combination of these portals that you can't get through, plus x-ray machines, plus cameras, you can have fewer actual physical people, and it ends up being cheaper, right? So I guess my only point is you should know that we spend a lot of time trying to think, how do we make the best use of money? And sometimes we do that by using technology and cutting down on our labor costs. So let me stop there and see if anyone has any questions on any of the things I covered, or, yeah.
At the beginning of your talk, you said that the feds are not part of the government. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Mm-hmm. But you spend public money.
Yes.
Okay. So are you nonprofit? Are you for profit? Are you?
So we're separately incorporated. So that's a really great question. So Congress has set up a particular kind of corporate structure that we have to follow. That's in the Federal Reserve Act. So we do issue stock. It's owned by what's called member banks. And the member banks are technically who owns us. Now, on the one hand, I think it's important to be direct about how that works. On the other hand, I think the important thing for folks to know, because oftentimes if I just left it at that, I think the takeaway would be, this is a group of people that are run by banks, right? And that's not really true. So we have got a corporate governance where we have a board of directors. We have different kinds of directors on our board. And the majority of those folks are either approved directly by the Board of Governors in DC, or the Board of Governors has oversight on their selection. So why am I saying that? So the way that we have the most direct accountability to the public in terms of governance is through this relation with the Board of Governors. So the board is a governmental entity. Janet Yellen ultimately oversees what we're doing here. They have staff that will review what we're doing. And through that connection, which is Congress, those folks go through the Senate nomination, they go through the presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. They provide oversight over what we're doing. At the same time, we've got this sort of private structure which gives us some independence. And the idea that the founders of the Federal Reserve Act had was, when it comes to things like monetary policy, you don't want everybody making monetary policy to be somebody who had to go through the political process to get nominated. So you have the folks at the Board of Governors, but then you have the reserve banks where the folks that are involved there are people who have oversight indirectly, but are primarily picked to reflect what's happening in the districts in which they're located. So it's a little bit of a complicated system in which it's got both private and public, but the idea would be that that would lead to better decision making and lead to decision making that wasn't beholden to one or the other. Does that make sense? That's a really important part. Kind of. It's all, okay, kind of, I should shoot higher than kind of. I'm going to shoot for like, yes, affirmatively. So let me try to maybe explain it this way. One of the issues that people are always concerned about, we talked about inflation. One issue that people get really concerned about is if you have a central bank, and again, I'm mostly talking about non-monetary policy, but here monetary policy is really the center. If you have a central bank that has all of its leadership and governance associated with the elected officials, when you look at the performance of those central banks over time relative to inflation, those are countries where they tend to have more inflation. And it's not because politicians want more inflation or people are bad. It's just that the incentives are set up a little bit more for example, to not want to try to take away, as people say, the punch bowl for the party. So when you're trying to fight against inflation, that's going to require you at some times to actually restrict the amount of economic activity that's happening as you're lowering inflation. And if you have a central bank that's completely governed and structured around people who are selected by elected officials, those central banks tend to perform worse than central banks that have more independence. So then the question is, how do you get the central bank to be independent of the political process in some ways, but overseen by the political process in other ways? Because ultimately we have to be accountable to Congress and the public. And so the system that the founders came up with was one in which the oversight of the entire Federal Reserve System comes from people who are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But the individual reserve banks have some independence because they're independent entities that where, for example, our president is picked by our board of directors, and the board of directors are sort of have some oversight from them from the board. So it is a more complicated, a little bit of a Rube Goldberg kind of structure, but the fundamental message is we're accountable, but a little bit independent, because that independent has some benefits. Is that a little better? Okay, maybe you just gave up. That's fine too. I'll take it. Other questions about that? That's really important. I mean, I think that gets to the heart of, it's an unusual structure here. Yeah.
Who's on the board?
Our board of directors? Sure, of our board of directors?
Private.
Yeah, sure. So our board of directors, yeah. So some of the stuff I'm trying to shy away from a little bit because it's a little bit complicated. But fundamentally, our board of directors are people that are supposed to be reflecting different parts of the community. So by the Federal Reserve Act, we have to have 3 bankers. That's part of the act, so Congress put that in there. And then we've got people who are basically who are appointed. Typically, they're associated with larger institutions, and they're going to be actually approved directly from, they're going to be selected by the Board of Governors. And we've got another group of people who are selected by the people who own this bank, which is bankers, but they're not bankers themselves. But if you look at, but I think maybe I should answer that question differently. So I would encourage you to look at our actual Board of Directors. So ignore the governance and who they were. Maybe I should do more about the real people that are actually on our board. So our chair right now is Mai Kao Hung, who runs the Wilder Foundation in St. Paul. So she runs a nonprofit that provides services to essentially mostly low-income individuals in St. Paul. She's the chair of our board. In some sense, I think that answers your question, right? Who's running it? It's Mai Kao Hung. And we've got other people on the board who are some folks. So the vice chair of our board is Ken Powell, who is the former CEO of General Mills. So we've got a wide range of people who are representing disparate groups of folks in the system, in the 9th District. Yeah.
Is the bank president, he's selected by the board of directors?
And
he's not a political appointee?
No, but the Board of Governors has to approve his selection. And they had to approve my selection too. So again, that's the sort of checks and balances. There's a private group that basically puts him forward, but people who had to go through the process of being approved by Congress have to approve it. So that's, I think, the thing about the checks and balances. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. And this is the new effort we have underway to try to think about basically, why is it that not everybody in the United States, by geography, by race, by ethnicity, by education, are not experiencing the economy the same way that other folks are? So this is a graph that looks at household income. So it's going to be adjusted for inflation, so it's what people are really earning. And I think the point that you'll see here is, this is broken out by the education levels, but if you compare black-led households against white-led households, on the bottom it's by high school education, on the top it's by college, you can see that there are big gaps between that. So a white household with the head of the household having the same education level as a white household or a black household which had the same education level have very different median incomes, right? So it's not just, I'm not just showing you though African American and white households not adjusted for education. If you adjust it for education, you get the same thing. There's these big gaps that are. And you can actually see for the college-educated households that relative to the 60s, it's much worse now than what it used to be. That is sort of both troubling, just on the face of it, but it's also troubling that we don't have a great handle on why that's occurring. And if you looked at that over time, and you looked at this in different ways, again, we're not just looking at this in terms of race or ethnicity. If you look at this by geography, if you look at this by other breakdowns of the population, you're going to see things like this, where there's different groups in the country that are experiencing very different economic outcomes, right? And exactly why that is a little bit unclear. So we've set up this institute to try to think through those issues. And so I've kind of alluded to this, but I want to sort of maybe give an analogy about how we're thinking about what the job of the institute is. And I'm going to use a medical analogy. So I find it useful to think about, there's 3 different kinds of ways that we all experience, or that we don't experience, that you can think about how medicine is provided in the US. All right? So there's these folks. They're going to show up at your house if there's a problem. And let's say they get confronted by something they've never seen before, right? You've just done something that is, either you have an illness they haven't seen before, or you've hurt yourself in a way they haven't seen before. They do not have the luxury of saying, you know something, I'm not really sure what to do here, so see you later. I'm just going to go back to the fire station or the hospital, and someone else can deal with it. They have to figure out what they're going to do because they're frontline providers of medicine, right? Again, so they can't say to you when they show up at your house, I'd like to do more research on this. I'll get back to you later. They have to figure out immediately what they're going to do. So there are people in society that are in the same position with regard to those income gaps. Their job isn't to think about, well, geez, gosh, I'm really not sure why we have these income gaps. I'm not sure what that means for you, so I can't help you. I mean, we have a support for United Way, like a lot of organizations do. We had the United Way in today, and one of the things they talked about is, they run a number, and it could be other organizations, I'm just picking the United Way by way of example, that if you are calling and you have an immediate service, you call this number and they refer you to someone who can help you immediately if you need shelter, right? So that's one aspect in which we could be thinking about the issues of disparities and inclusive growth. Then there's a slightly different group of people that we typically, so this is more typical of how we engage with medicine, right? We can go to a doctor, they have a little more time, they can do a little bit more work, they can try to figure it out. That's also another model of how you could think about what's happening around the sort of issues we're facing, disparities in income. That maybe would be a little bit more like policymakers. They don't have to act today. They have to act eventually. They're going to do something. They want to be informed, but they're also not going to do, they can't sort of just infinitely put it off. That's also not what we're going to do at the Institute. Okay, so what are we doing at the Institute? Fundamentally, not exclusively, but fundamentally, we're going to do basic research. So these are people who try to answer the question, how do cells work? When I look at this aspect of the cell, how does it ultimately work with the rest of the body? I've got a cousin who studies epilepsy. That's kind of what they're looking at. They're doing deep research into how cells are working. And the idea is, if you do this kind of deep work, it takes a long time, and it doesn't always produce something tomorrow, it informs the doctors, who then can do work that's going to inform someone when they show up at your house and you need help. That's what we're going to try to do here. We've got people, and we're going to give them some time to think through fundamentally what's happening around these issues of disparities. So we're not replacing people who are going to be doing immediate service. We're going to be working with them, and we're going to try to make sure that we're informed about what we're doing. And we're also not going to be doing things that are immediate policy payoffs right this minute. We're going to do some of that, but the focus of what we're going to be doing is on this deep research to try to understand the fundamentals of what's happening in the United States economy, creating new data, and trying to figure out how we can advance the basic research associated with inclusive growth and opportunity. So let me stop there and see if anyone has questions about what we're trying to do. Yeah?
On the chart where you showed the income, is that gross income?
Is that gross income? You mean sort of net of, just the total income out, not expenses?
Well, is it after-tax income? Does it include, money?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't actually know the answer to that. I think it's typically the gross amount, but I can go back and look. Yeah, but I think even when you take account of transfer payments, so for example, the government kind of comes in, that's going to reduce some of that gap, but it's not going to eliminate it. Other questions about the Institute? I'd encourage you to go look at our webpage about what they're doing. There's a lot of papers that I've already produced. We have conferences that we're going to be showing. And again, the fact that it's basic research doesn't mean it's going to be inaccessible or that it's remote from what you're doing, but I think we ought to set the expectation for what it is we think we've got expertise in, right? We're not going to be replacing people that are doing direct service provision, and we're not going to be out there every day making policy prescriptions. We're going to be setting the stage so that we can ultimately help figure out how to solve these in the long run. We have another effort underway. It's called, and this is the last slide I'm going to show. It's called the Center for Indian Country Development. So Indian country is actually a term of, is a term that is actually like a formal term to think about the reservations in other parts of the United States under Native American control. And this group is really set up to try to, we've got a lot of reservations and Indian land in Indian country in our district. And this is an area where we think we need to have some expertise to figure out once we hear from those communities, how can we be assistance of helping them achieve the goals that they've set for themselves? And here we're doing research. Research is an important component of what we're doing there too. And I thought I would just show a little bit, one graph that I'm hoping gives you a sense of the kind of work that they're doing. So one of the areas of focus for the center is on home ownership among American Indians. And one thing that's interesting is there's a program where if you're an American Indian, you can get a guaranteed mortgage, where the government will basically take the risk of the mortgage so that when the bank makes the loan, they don't have to worry about the credit risk of the person involved. And let me just say, this isn't unique to American Indians. I mean, the government has lots of programs like this across the board for different populations in the country. So it's interesting. So this is, again, so this is showing you the number of these sorts of loans that are made, which are guaranteed. So there's different lines here. So what are those lines? So the line where there's a lot of activity are for purchases of homes that are not going to be on the reservation itself, more or less. I'm sort of using the terms loosely, but that's the general idea. And you can see that there's less activity when you look at what's happening on the reservations. And when you talk to the folks at the center, one thing they'll tell you is this disparity that you're seeing is because actually getting title and going through the title process for folks that are on reservations is really, really challenging. It takes a really long time. Even if you take the credit risk out of the mortgage, it's really hard to actually go through the process of ensuring that the people who are owning the land and providing it as collateral can do that. So that's a real insight, right? That means that some of the problems, we know where to focus, right? We know to focus on this titling issue. That's some of the work that's happening in the center, just to give you a flavor for it. There's a lot of other work. And there's a lot of other things that we're doing around this thought leadership, but I think that gives you a flavor for that, a main component of it is that we're working on issues where we're going to be doing research where we think we can find underlying problems and then come forward with ideas and solutions for solving them. So I'll just sum up with how I started. Which is fundamentally, there's a lot of people here at this bank that are doing things on behalf of all of you that I think it's important for you to understand what we're doing, and I think it's important for you to feel comfortable that what we're doing is sort of on your behalf and done effectively. So I'll stop there and see if there's any additional questions, and I'll stay afterwards to see if there's something you don't want to ask in a group setting. And you can ask me about anything that you want covered or not covered.
I was curious, as far as the research you were talking about, who decides what to research or provides guidance towards what to research?
Yeah. So let me answer that question in sort of two dimensions, right? So I pointed to, we have these economists that work here. And generally speaking, what we try to do is have people that we know are interested in sort of topics and areas that we think are going to be important for the Federal Reserve to have expertise. And then once they work here, we generally give them a lot of leeway in terms of the kinds of issues that they take on. So why do we do that? If you want to attract the best and brightest folks to work on deep, important issues, and you tell them, well, hold on, here's exactly how you have to do it. You can cover this, you can't cover this, etc. All the people that we have here have other options, many of which are pretty good, working at top-notch universities. And so I think the main thing we do to make sure that they're working on things that are going to be valuable to everybody here is by bringing in people whose interests are aligned with what we're doing and then giving them some freedom to work on things. At the same time, of course, if there's some particular issue that we're interested in, there are employees here and they'll do that work. how did we decide that we're going to focus on disparities and inclusive growth? How did we decide that we're going to focus on issues in Indian country? We've got other issues. We've looked at the issue of banks that are, quote unquote, too big to fail. What we've tried to do is think, what are the single most important issues that are confronting the country, confronting the district, confronting people in Minneapolis and St. Paul? And those are the ones that we've tried to pick. I think the other thing I'll add is we try not to duplicate work that we see going on other places. There's not a lot of value add to be the sixth person working on something. So that's the process we use to figure out what to work on and what not to work on. Yeah.
I've got a question. The work that the Minneapolis Fed is doing, is that typical of what the other districts are doing the same thing, or do you get together and kind of figure out the best group to do it?
So it's similar on the broad categories that I picked. So like payments, all the reserve banks are going to have something around payments, but the Atlanta Fed, for example, so ACH, right, the Automated Clearinghouse Network. So how many people here have like direct deposit? So so the Federal Reserve processes about half of all the direct deposit payments in the country. That's all run out of Atlanta. So in the sense that, we did some things unique here, like those tokens. We do that. Atlanta does some of the retail stuff. New York does the payments between banks. San Francisco oversees all of the cash work. So we've divided it up differently, but they all would have some category underneath that looks like what I covered.
I guess I was more interested in like the initiative and the native...
Okay, the research stuff. Yeah, okay. So the research stuff has a lot less coordination than the rest of it for kind of the reason that I articulated it. Now it ends up that our own operational style is that we don't sort of duplicate what other people are doing. So you're not going to see things like what I showed you. No one else is doing the things that we're doing, except for, I would say, monetary policy. So every president's going to be voting on monetary policy. So every president's going to have an apparatus designed and having people do some research on monetary policy. But even there, it's usually from a different angle. And I think part of our goal of being efficient is making sure that we're not just duplicating what other people are doing. Was that more responsive? Okay.
Two-part question.
Sure.
Update on too big to fail. You're pioneer in that area.
Sure.
And also, biggest concerns that you see in our economy.
Yeah, so the too big to fail question, let me just do a little bit of context setting for that. So this is the issue that people, we'll do like a little show of hands. Too big to fail, how many people already feel like they know exactly what we're talking about? Okay, so that's like half. So that's really the issue about these banks. When banks, after the financial crisis, got in trouble, and when they got in trouble, the rest of the economy basically went south, and we had a huge financial crisis. So the question is, how do we sort of prevent that from happening again? So we have a specific proposal that we have here, which would basically require these banks to go out and raise a big cushion of money so that if they get into trouble, they'll have enough money to absorb that. So that was a proposal that came out at the end of last year, November of last year. We put it out for comment. We got feedback. We were revising what we're doing to make sure that we're responding to the feedback we got. And I think we're getting close to deciding, to being final and putting something else out final. So that's where that stands. What are the big threats to the economy? I think one thing that's really, front and center for people here is this issue, is really the issue associated, it's one step back. So broadly speaking, the thing about inclusive growth and opportunity, we think that's a huge issue. So that's why we're devoting so much time and resources to it. Sort of immediately, one issue that the Federal Reserve has is we're supposed to be ensuring that we are making sure that inflation doesn't get too high. That's how I sort of explained it. That's how people normally say it. But we also have to make sure that inflation doesn't get too low, right? We really want it to be around 2%. And inflation for 4 or 5 years hasn't been there. And so I think the president of our bank, Neil Kashkari, has been spending a lot of time trying to think about why is it that we've been unable to get inflation closer to where we want to be. So, fundamentally, I think that's a little bit of a risk to the economy, because if inflation is too low, then if we have another contraction in the economy, we'll find ourselves at a place where we can't use all the tools that we have right now. So I think that's one thing we're worried about. And that we're being very public about, and I would encourage you to look at our website. I would encourage you to follow Neil or me or any of the bank on Twitter, and you'll see some of the work that we're doing there. Yeah. And I want to be cognizant of time, so I don't know what time technically these things end. So again, if you feel like, hey, I didn't sign up for staying till 8:15 or whatever, I'm not offended if you leave.
Prior to the financial crisis in 2008, did the Fed have stress-like tests? And if they did, how predictive were they? Yeah.
So, we did not have anything as comprehensive and as good as what we have now. So that's the short answer. So I do want to pat myself on the back. So I did write a book in 2004 with the former president, and one of the things we said that the Fed ought to do is stress tests. Along the lines of we didn't forecast exactly what we're doing now, but we did say we ought to do that. And there were some people who said, hey, we should be doing more of that kind of stuff. So I guess the short answer is no, we didn't really do it. But you know what was interesting? There was some work, and this has been made public, there was some work that folks did at the board trying to answer the following question. They asked, what would happen if housing prices fell by 40 or 50%? I don't remember the exact amount they looked at. And what they found was that it would be terrible. So they had a good sense that it wouldn't be something that would just sort of happen and not be a big deal. The issue was they thought the chance of it happening was so remote that they didn't really take it as something that we had to be planning against. And I think that's fundamentally what we learned from the crisis. And let me just connect it back to our too big to fail effort that we have underway now. So really what we're trying to do is, if you think about it, we want to make sure that banks have enough protection that they don't have to come to the taxpayer, even if we have something that seems like it's not really likely to happen. So why is that? Even though the chance of these things happening are really small, so they look like they're never going to happen, when they do happen, they're so costly that even if you multiplied the chance of this thing happening, even though the chance of it happening is teeny, 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 it's so huge when it does happen that you still get a big number when you multiply the chance of it happening by the effect of it. So why am I bringing it up? These things seem like they're never going to happen. They happen once every 100 years, 50 years, or whatever. I think we've seen for the last 7 weeks in terms of weather that if you don't have some safeguards against some of these things, that the cost is so enormous when they have it that in retrospect you look back and you say, boy, it would have been worth investing some more money in terms of protection. So people underestimate sometimes the value of protection. It only becomes clear after the fact, and what we're arguing is that you need to have some protection before. Oh, okay. Just back there.
This might be speculative at this point, but if the immigration issue becomes real, how would the exit of a lot of employees affect the economy, in that it would affect people's businesses? They'd have to scramble to get those positions filled. Has anybody thought about how that could affect our economy?
Yeah, so I think even in just sort of casual observations through the newspaper and the radio, et cetera, you already hear certain sectors of the economy that are heavily reliant on immigration, so agriculture, which is obviously very present in our district. I think people have been really straightforward, that they don't feel like they would have an easy time replacing that. And again, it depends on sector. And fundamentally, as an economist, I think would think about it, you would think that, what would happen is that wages maybe would go up for other places. I guess one issue that's sort of not clear is the ability of the firms to be profitable at the prevailing wage they would need to get. Alternatively, maybe there's something going on where people don't want to work at these jobs even if they're, a particularly high amount of money. So I think the immediate issue would be sort of some clear dislocation in certain industries. I think the broader question, and again, I'm going to refer back to some of the stuff that our president has said because I think he's been really articulate and clear on it. If you look at how economies grow, there's two parts to the equation. Growth of an economy happens when populations grow and when you become more productive. That's sort of the engine of where growth is going to come from. the U.S. sort of birth rate is like many birth rates, across the country. Ours is actually a little higher, than Japan or some other places. But fundamentally, the reason why we're sort of having more folks just present in the economy is in part due to immigration. And if you take that part out of the equation, then you're going to have lower growth. And that might be fine. As Neil points out, you could also try to get people domestically to have more babies. That's not easy. I mean, you can try to do that. You can you subsidize, child care and things like that. But fundamentally, that's what that looks like. So for the long run for the U.S. economy, some of this is just math. And by the way, that's not a political statement. That's not a pro-immigration or anti-immigration. That's just the decisions we're going to make around immigration have implications for what growth looks like in the country. We might decide, hey, net, we're better off not growing as much. And that's just a decision we have to make. But I guess, in the spirit of being an institution that's with a lot of economists, there's no free lunch here, right? You can't just sort of decide you're going to do something and have none of it. It doesn't have implications. I think there was a question up front. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead. I wanted to ask about the Fed's balance sheet, maybe beyond the scope of this topic, but what do you guys know in Minneapolis about what the FOMC and the New York Fed says about unwinding and perhaps selling some of those securities?
Right. So we just came out at the last FOMC meeting about what we're going to do. So I'm glad you asked because, again, I think sometimes we end up speaking to kind of like experts who already know what we're doing, and so we're not always totally clear. So we're not selling. We have this big balance sheet. I mentioned we bought all these securities. So we're not talking about selling any of those securities, right? So if we're not going to sell the securities, how is the balance sheet going to get smaller, which was what was announced? So right now, when a security basically is mature, so let's say, again, I want to make this at the most basic terms. So imagine a security is like a loan, and it's going to be due at 1 year. And when 1 year comes up, we get all the money associated with the loan. Right now, what we do is we reinvest that and we go and make another loan. Effectively, we buy another security, right? And that way we keep the size of the balance sheet constant. What we're talking about is not reinvesting. So when something matures, so when the security no longer is going to be paying us any money, instead of going out and buying another one, we're just going to let that one fall. And over time, by not reinvesting, the balance sheet's going to shrink. So we're not talking about selling anything. We're talking about just simply, just letting it sort of go down by itself, right? So we're going to be losing weight by really not, if you take a hot dog out of my hand, we're just not going to get another hot dog. We're not going to really fundamentally sort of, start, so we're not going to exercise. Maybe that's the right way. I think that was probably not a very helpful analogy, but I'll work on a better one. But it's something like that.
So is that kind of with the bailouts and what the banks are doing with some of the funds at the local level? And then what happens to the principal payment then? The money that's not reinvested? How is it redistributed, or is it?
So I think the way to think about it is, right, okay, so if our balance sheet goes down, what happens to the rest of the economy, right? Yeah. There is a repayment then. Yeah, so we're holding a treasury security, right? So we're going to get the payment of the treasury security, right? And so we're not going to buy another. So we're going to have cash, basically. And then, right, so then over time we're going to, so we're no longer going to, so the balance sheet is sort of changing composition, and then it's going to shrink over time because we're going to sort of, simultaneously we're making payments to folks who've got reserves and things here. So the money's going to flow out, and we're going to sort of have that go down over time. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Talk about reversing the interest on reserves decision and having banks lend.
Yeah. So I'm going to follow up separate on that just because I feel like it's going to be more of a complicated conversation. I'm not trying to duck it or anything. I just feel like given the time, I want to make sure I'm, not. Okay. Yeah.
That was basically my question.
Oh, I got it. Well, boy, there's like a rush at 8:30 for talking about reserves.
Normalization of interest rates, how will that occur?
So, that is a different question. So, how will the normalization of interest rates? So I think what we're talking about here is, we've kept rates low for many, many years. And over time, we've increased the rates the target rate that we have for monetary policy. That's basically how monetary policy works. Most of the time, we had this big balance sheet, but most of the time we just move interest rates up and down. And when we want to be more stimulative to the economy, we lower interest rates. And we want to be more restrictive, we raise interest rates. So we've been slowly raising interest rates. And in the last FOMC meeting, we said that we're going to continue doing that at a deliberate pace. So that's going to, I think the way to think about that, over time, we're going to slowly have interest rates rise. So why don't I take one more if we have it, and then we'll formally conclude, but I'll stay here and take any other questions. Okay, well, I view all of you as a little bit being ambassadors, not ambassadors for us, but just being knowledgeable people about how the Fed works. And I hope that I've conveyed that we're working for you, and we hope we're doing a good job. Thanks.
Thank you. We would really appreciate it if you fill out your evaluation form so we can hear about what topics